In and by. Items sorted out of my experiences on the Fort Worth stockyards, 1945 through 1955, by Bill Sloan. Narrated by Elizabeth Mull. Preface. This is a book about events and the people who did them on the Fort Worth stockyards. Now that the Fort Worth stockyards has been saved from the wrecking ball and is a tourist attraction, it is time to tell of some of the things that happened in the area. The things I tell about in this book, I saw or heard or was involved in. There is nothing sensational to read in this book. Since I am not a writer or storyteller, I can only tell what I saw, but in some instances the truth is certainly stranger than fiction. The Fort Worth stockyards was a big operation in its day. At any one time, there were probably 400 men on the yards, including the cattle yards, hog and sheep yards, and horse and mule barns, and 50 or 60 men and women in the offices. Very little publicity has been given this group, and it is time they were recognized. The great majority of them do not want any recognition and would hide from it if it appeared. My wife June urged me to write this book because I complained a lot about the lack of a book about the yards and the little recognition given to those who deserved it. So here it is, the way I saw it. Someone else may have seen it differently. They can write their own book. Introduction. Why the title In and By? One of the major items of work in handling cattle on the yards was sorting. Cattle were sorted by size, shape, color, weight, sex, age, and any other criteria that could be thought of. There were two accepted ways of sorting. If only 2 or 3 cattle needed to be moved out of one pen fold to another, the sorters went in the pen, located the cattle they wanted, and with careful handling cut them out of the pen and into the alley. When several pens of cattle needed to be sorted, they were sorted in an alley, either into a pen, or by, down the alley. Some were sorted in and others by, and the result was a good load of cattle. I hope that in sorting my recollections in and by, I have shaped up an interesting book. After being exposed to the Fort Worth stockyards most of my life and having spent 10 years there, I saw and learned a lot. I think I am qualified to relate some of the things that I saw, heard, and was involved in. This book is about the cattle yards only. The sheep and hog yards operated in a similar manner, but there was a great difference in the way that the animals themselves were handled. In my years on the yards, I never went to the sheep and hog yards more than a couple of times. I'm not the one to be writing a book. My qualifications are a couple of years in journalism in high school. I took journalism because it was easier than English, and I was fortunate enough to have gasoline, it being wartime, so I was appointed to drive to the printers to proofread the high school paper every week. If I took enough time, I could miss another class or two. My father, Clarence Sloan, started to work on the yards in 1906 or 1907 and spent most of his life there until he died in 1967. He told me lots of tales of the early days on the yards, but at the time I did not have enough interest in history to remember or appreciate most of them. Most books and articles on the yards leave a lot untold and only mention a very few names. There is a simple explanation for this. The stockyards people were a closed-mouthed bunch and didn't believe in talking about themselves or their accomplishments. But it's time that recognition was given to that group and time to let it be known that the yards was a pretty big operation. There was more than one commission company and more than one cattle dealer, and neither could operate without the other. It took a lot of men and a lot of teamwork to make it function. In the dedication of this book, there are names of more than 400 men and women I personally knew and worked with, and there were another 100 or so whose names I never knew. I don't think I was ever formally introduced to more than 5 or 6 of these people. You just automatically knew them. Most authors want to sensationalize the events that happened around the yard so that it sounds like there was a gunfight every day and a trainload of cattle stolen every night. There were some cattle stolen and a few killings on Exchange Avenue, but the killings were in no way related to cattle trades or cattle rustling on the yards, except that the killer or victim may have worked there. The 10 years that I was there covered the best of times and the worst of times. The time during World War II, when meat was a scarce commodity, through the boom of the post-war years to the senile period of the yards when it was on its deathbed. Fortunately, I left before it died. I must admit that I couldn't stand to go to the yards for several years after I left because of the old memories, the blood, sweat, and tears, the ice, snow, dust, heat, noise, friends, hard times, and good times. Even while I write this, it is hard to keep from getting a little misty-eyed. In talking to some of the old hands, I find that I am not alone in this feeling. It's quite a sensation to go through the building where you spent so many years and see it converted into something you never dreamed you would see. And to see it full of people who would not have set foot in it while it was in its glory. I can accept some of those changes, but the one that I think is the funniest thing ever is the valet parking only sign in front of the Stockyards Hotel. I can remember the people and events of 40 years ago more vividly than those of a few weeks ago. I don't claim to be a writer, but if I don't tell of the things I saw and was part of, I doubt that anyone else will. A few years ago, I was talking to an old hand from the yards and mentioned that I would like to talk to some of the old timers. It hit home when he said, "Start talking because we are the old timers now." I doubt that I contributed to the history of the yards, but I sure saw a lot of it happen. I am proud of and consider it an honor to have been part of that era on the yards. Chapter 1: My Introduction to the Yards. My first job on the yards was in the summer of 1935. I was 9 years old and was working for Claude "Doc" Minter, who was the manager of the O.M. Franklin Blackleg Serum Company in the Exchange Building. My work consisted of helping Mr. Minter fill orders for serum, vaccine, and other supplies from the warehouse in a garage behind the building, packing the orders and taking them to the mailbox in the lobby, learning terms like hemorrhagic septicemia and Clostridium chavos septicus Bactrin, and drinking soda pop. I think my pay was $1 a week and all the soda pop I could drink. But as older readers will remember, all you were allowed to drink amounted to no more than 2 a day. I spent several weeks with him that summer and intended to work for him the next year. But 1936 was the year I got involved with Paul Whiteman, and that's another story. The next time I worked on the yards was in the summer of 1942, when I worked as a yard hand for my father, Clarence Sloan, who owned and operated Sloan Cattle Company, at that time the largest order-buying operation on the yards. Clarence Sloan was an excellent judge of cattle, as were most experienced traders and salesmen, and had a large number of customers in the East. A person had to have an excellent reputation and be a good judge of cattle to survive in the business. The only kind of cattle deals that were ever written down were contracts to buy cattle for future delivery, and not all of them were written. If a buyer said, "I'll give so much for one head, a carload, or a trainload of cattle," he was honor-bound to pay for them regardless of the consequences. The same applied if he were selling. He was honor-bound to complete the deal. If a person ever backed out on a deal, he might as well leave the country because he was finished locally, and his bad reputation would follow him wherever he went. After graduating from high school in 1944, I went to work on the yards full-time in early 1945. Except for being exposed to A&M in the fall of 45, I was there practically every day until 1955. My first salary in 1935 was about $1 a week, as I mentioned. In 1944 and 45, I was getting $25 a week, which netted $21.65 after withholding. In 1947, I was making $40 a week, and in 1950 or so, I got $50. This was pretty much the standard wage at the time for yard hands. Order buyers and salesmen made from $75 or so in the early 40s to $100 or $125 by the early 50s. The 400 plus people I mentioned in the dedication of this book covered the human spectrum. There was no seniority or chain of command among the commission companies or order buyers. The lowest paid hand worked with the highest paid ones and might have dealt directly with the richest rancher in the country when the rancher came to the yards. In other words, the boss could be just as dirty and work just as hard as the flunky. There was no bad blood on the yards. There were a few men who did not particularly like each other, but they conducted business with each other just the same. If there had been feuds or bad blood, the yards could not have functioned. True, there were problems that arose from time to time, and if the problem concerned a cattle deal, sometimes a third party was asked to arbitrate. This happened to me once when a salesman weighed me a cripple that I had overlooked. When I could get no satisfaction from the salesman, I asked Joe Lane to settle it for me, which he did immediately in my favor. This was a situation where honor was concerned, but in a gray area. A man was not supposed to weigh to another man any animal that was crippled or in any way unmerchantable. Try saying that word real fast. However, a buyer was supposed to be alert and not buy a crip. Chapter 2. Clarence Sloan, Cattle Buyer. Clarence Sloan was known to most people as C. Sloan because he didn't like the name Clarence. Strangely enough, there were at least 3 other men named Clarence on the yards. Sloan was born in Cherry Vale, Kansas in July of 1888. The reason I don't give a day is that no one was ever sure of his birthday because he would never give the same date twice. To my knowledge, he never posed for more than 3 photographs, and 2 of these were snapshots. I don't know the reason for his being camera shy, but he was a master at dodging cameras. One of the rare photographs of him is included in this book. It was taken in 1937 when Paul Whiteman, the band leader, bought a load of cattle for Swift and Company as a publicity stunt. His father and grandfather were doctors in Missouri and Kansas, and later his father moved to Grayson County, Texas, where his maternal grandparents lived. His maternal grandfather, Harrison Davis, was a prominent farmer and mule raiser in Grayson County. Sloan graduated from Carlisle Military Academy, now University of Texas, Arlington, and attended Texas Agricultural and Mechanical College, where he studied engineering. By 1907, he was on the yards, and in 1911 was working for R.M. Tadlock as a bull buyer. Shortly after this, he married Frances Van Zandt, daughter of Major K.M. Van Zandt, and started trading cattle on his own. After serving in France and Germany during World War I, he and Roy Van Ham formed Van Ham Sloan Cattle Company, a clearinghouse, in the 1920s. They were doing well financially, but lost everything when the Depression hit the yards in 1929. Many years later, Sloan pointed out to me several prominent traders as men who still owed him money from 1929, but to my knowledge, few of them ever fully paid their debts. During this partnership, Sloan was trading cattle as well as operating the Van Ham Sloan Clearinghouse. Sloan also leased the Hicks Ranch north of Saginaw for several years in the 1920s. Much of this ranch was later covered by Eagle Mountain Lake. Some of the hands who cowboyed for Sloan on this ranch were Roy Matthews, Sam Stewart, Buck Stewart, Charlie McDaniel, Pony Star, and others. Roy and Sam both became prominent rodeo contestants. After losing his money in 1929, Sloan was hired by a Fort Worth bank to repossess the lake ranch at Pecos. The bank had made a loan on this ranch and had tried several times to repossess it, but the party in charge threatened to shoot anyone who tried to evict him. This didn't bother Sloan, who armed himself and did take possession and settle the affair, although the other party still blustered that he would kill him on sight. This episode added to Sloan's reputation of not backing away from anyone. As was the case with most people in the cattle business, Sloan did not let a little thing like being broke stop him. By 1932, he was on the way back in the cattle business. He made some contacts with cattle dealers in Ohio and Virginia that proved profitable over the next 15 years. In the early 30s, he bought lots of cattle in Mexico and shipped them to customers in the East. Later, handling a better class of cattle, he limited his buying area to West Texas. By 1937, he shipped more than 500 carloads, about 17,000 head, of cattle per year, and soon after was the biggest operator on the yards, a position he held for several more years. By 1950, having populated Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania with cattle, he semi-retired. Although Sloan was financially well off, the fear of losing his money again never allowed him to enjoy it. Like all the old-timers at the yards, he felt the place couldn't open without him, so he continued going to the yards almost daily until his death in April 1967. Sloan was small in size, only about 5'7". He was dark complected and usually a very quiet man. He did not socialize much in later years, but I hear he did a lot of it in his bachelorhood when he lived at the Fort Worth Club. Sloan was a neat dresser, even to polish shoes. I never saw him wear a pair of shoes more than 3 or 4 times between polishings. As soon as an article of clothing showed a little wear, he got rid of it. He was polite to the ladies, always standing and removing his hat when he talked to them. He was a master at giving me what is now known as a guilt trip. Many times I would be dressed and ready to leave the house on a date when he would mention that it looked like snow and his poor steers might freeze to death before morning. So I would change clothes, saddle a horse, pin the cattle in the barn, change clothes again, and arrive for my date an hour or so later than planned. There was only one person in the world who could con Sloan into anything, and that was a hand who worked for him for several years. This hand could talk Sloan into financing horses or cars for him, lending him money that he was not thinking of paying back, and many other schemes. 2 or 3 of Sloan's hands threatened to quit if he didn't fire this man, but Sloan talked them out of the notion and kept him for another year or so. There was a rancher in southern Wise County who was known as a hard trader and who was difficult to deal with. This man had good quality cattle that were warranted by many traders, but because of the rancher's disposition, not too many of them tried to deal with him. Sloan often told that one day a fancy-dressed city-type man wearing spats and a derby hat drove his buggy, this was in the early days, to the man's ranch and said he wanted to buy some cattle. The rancher thought he would make a killing on someone dressed like this buyer, so he showed him his herd. The buyer seemed to notice only the sorriest cattle in the herd and commented on what beautiful animals they were. The rancher knew he had it made and sold his herd to the city slicker, allowing him to sort the cattle as he saw fit. The cattle were to be delivered the next week. When the buyer arrived to sort and receive the cattle, he was dressed in the working clothes of a cowman and proceeded to cut out all the beautiful animals he had described the week before and take only the best of the herd. The rancher was the one taken on the deal, and the buyer came out in good shape. Sloan would never tell who the buyer was, but I have enough evidence to know that it was Sloan himself. Clarence Sloan was not the first or last cattle dealer on the yards, but for a few years he was the biggest and did his share in adding to the history of the yards. Chapter 3, the day-to-day routine. Let me take you through a few typical days on the yards, as it was in my time. It was not much different in the earlier days and was still basically the same until the auction sale became the major activity at the yards. In the 30s and earlier, the yards were operating 6 days a week. When they got soft in the early 40s, they started closing on Saturdays. Buyers were able to buy cattle anytime there was enough daylight to see the cattle. Buyers and traders met in the lobby of the exchange building every morning at 6 or so, depending on the time of year, and matched to determine the order in which they could look at cattle at the commission companies. To allow buyers a turn at a commission company and to prevent favoritism to a buyer, matching was necessary because there may have been several buyers for one class of cattle and only 1 or 2 commission companies might have this class for sale. This was not necessarily the best way to determine this, but no one ever came up with a better idea. When the matching began each morning, the order buyers or someone representing them sat in a circle on the west side of the lobby using coat cases, they were wooden in those days, for seats. For most of my time at the yards, Ernest Inky Bobo was the dealer. He used a deck of cards that included the spades and enough other cards to allow 1 card for each buyer in the circle. After shuffling the cards, he proceeded clockwise around the circle to turn up a card for each man. If the card was a spade, he called out the number and the name of the buyer. If not a spade, the buyer got nothing. If the ace of spades was turned up, the buyer got a first with the commission company being matched for at that time. A deuce of spades meant a second, etc. After the circle had been called, the cards were reshuffled, the caller moved on to the next commission company on the list, and the process was repeated until 30 rounds. The number of companies and groups of companies had been completed. When a buyer bought cattle from the commission company, the salesman gave his weigher the buyer's name, selling price, and how the cattle were to be weighed. The weigher had already made a list of owners and pen numbers. Now he had a list of buyers to go with it. Many buyers and salesmen got their experience from years spent working as a weigher. The commission companies also had a form of matching to see who could weigh first, and they usually weighed for an hour at a time during heavy runs of cattle. Sometimes the commission companies weighed only 1 or 2 drafts during their turn. During lighter runs, it was first come, first served at the scales. The weighers sometimes used a card listing all the transactions, but the best of them kept hundreds of transactions in their heads with nothing on paper. Charlie Thomason started to work for Johnny Schwartz as a weigher many years ago. To impress Schwartz with his ability and thoroughness, he made out a card with all shippers, cattle, and pen numbers. He showed the card to Schwartz, who looked the card over, told Charlie it looked good, then tore it up, and told him to keep all the information in his head. At one time, a couple of the faster weighers were Dub Jenkins and Nubbin Hector, who worked for National Livestock Commission Company. Once, they had a dispute with the commission company over pay and did not show up for work the next time there was a big run. It was pretty funny to see people from the sheepyards as well as some of the office staff trying to sort out the cattle and get them weighed. Needless to say, they all worked pretty late that night, and Jenkins and Hector were welcomed back. This was one of the few incidents that resembled a strike among the yard hands, but the Stockyards Company hands did have a couple of strikes while I was there. There was no violence or anything sensational about the strikes, and I think the union got whatever it was demanding. These strikes were called during light runs and only lasted a couple of days. Some of the other top weighers during my time were Bill Gardenhire, Bill Addeway, Charlie Thomason, Herb Kilgore, Sidney Jenkins, and Wade Choate. These were only a few of them. Most of them went on to be top salesmen and buyers, and some of them eventually owned commission companies. Hector later joined the Border Patrol for a year or so, then returned to the corner where he died from a beating. Yard hands worked for commission companies, order buyers, and speculators. Their duties consisted of taking care of cattle, feeding, driving, sorting, etc., and also included cleaning pens. I could have said something besides cleaning pens, and it would have been perfectly acceptable in this day and time. Although a lot of the people on the yards were as tough as could be, and their language was as foul and dirty as anywhere in the world, there was an unwritten law that language was kept clean around women, and this was pretty well the way it was, with very few exceptions. Jewel Tinsley told me that in the many years she worked in the building, there was never a time that she was not treated like a lady, which of course she was. There were very few who were not in that category. When a woman visited the yards, her presence was known and passed on to anyone close by, so that language was proper and clean in most cases. But there were certainly exceptions. The Stockyards Company men, being union men, were able to keep reasonably regular hours sometimes with overtime, but the other hands, including buyers and commission men, had no idea of what regular hours were. A typical day started at 5 or 6 in the morning and could end as early as 8 or 9 a.m. or as late as 8 or 9 p.m. I remember once when I didn't get home until 2 a.m. and barely had time to bathe and eat so I could be back at the yards by 5 a.m. I knew some people who didn't even go home for 2 or 3 days at a stretch. You might think that a person working in such an environment might not pay much attention to cleanliness, but 99% showed up clean and smelling good every morning. There were a couple of exceptions, though, who usually bathed a couple of times a month, whether they needed to or not. After a long hot day, you could get pretty dirty. Since we had no facilities for cleaning up, no OSHA, we often used a water trough for a bathtub, but only in the summer. After this bath, you were clean enough to go home and get a real bath. It could be exciting when one of your friends got a bucket of ice water out of the cooler and poured it on you in the tub. We were lucky for a while. One of the boys found an unlocked door in the building where Billy Bob's Texas is now located and discovered running water in the showers. We were a pretty clean bunch until somebody with the city of Fort Worth locked the door a few weeks later. If you were a yard hand, your day started around 6 a.m. or whenever it was light enough to see and your pens had been unlocked by the keyman. You had to clean and fill the water troughs, put fresh hay in the hay mangers, feed cottonseed holes if necessary, and order whatever amount of feed that might be needed to start the day. Multiply this by the number of pens you had, 7 in our case, and it could take a while to complete the job. Then you could have a few minutes off. In most cases, you did not have every pen full of cattle in the mornings because traders tried to get all their cattle shipped out before going home the previous day. But you had to put feed in the empty pens for the cattle that would be brought home during the day. If you worked for a man who might have a pasture within 10 or 12 miles of the yards, you might have to go to the pasture to feed cattle there and then return to the yards. After feeding, depending on the time of day, you might be expected to clean the pens or alleys. The stockyards company had a crew that cleaned the pens and alleys, but they only had 2 tractors with loaders, 6 or 8 trucks, and 12 or 14 men to clean the whole yards. In most cases, they could handle the job, but if they ever got behind for any reason, it took a long time to catch up. When the stockyards company could not get to your pens and alleys, main alleys had priority over pens, you had to clean them yourself and pile manure in the alleys. If you never saw the yards when it needed cleaning, there's no way to accurately describe it. 12 or more inches of manure mixed with straw and compacted by hundreds of hooves has the consistency of adobe when it is damp and the adhesiveness of hot asphalt when it is thoroughly wet. You could get a real thrill when walking through it to have it pull your boots off. Even though most of the yards was paved with brick, there were some sections of alleys and a few pens that had no bricks on them. These were used mostly to keep sore-footed cattle or as a place to ride a young horse that might buck you off. There was a dirt alley by number 2 scale, and I never did understand its purpose, but it held a lot of water when it rained, and we had to detour by another route in wet weather. After a buyer had bought several cattle and notified you of his buys, you started out to pick up the cattle. You planned your pickup depending on the location of the scales where your cattle would be weighed. If there were only a few to be picked up at number 5, the farthest away, and you knew that they would be weighed late, you might start at number 1 or number 2, closer, and work your way back to your division. I might add that you nearly always plan to stop for a cup of coffee in the building if there was time. Before Wendy Ryan started his Western store in the lobby of the building, you might sit around the lobby on Coke cases from Charlie Reichenstein's Coke stand or go out on the porch and sit around to kill time when you had to wait an hour or so for some of your cattle to be weighed. The hardest work on the yards was the waiting. I didn't mind the work, but the waiting was murder, especially if you had nearly everything done for the day and had to wait a couple of hours for 2 or 3 head to be weighed at some far-off place like number 5. Sometimes we had a lot of time to visit on the yards. If you had any length of time, sometimes an hour or so, to wait at a scale for your cattle, you could go to the building or sit around the scale house or the commission company booth and visit with others who had to wait too. Sometimes there might be as many as 12 or 15 hands waiting to pick up. Lots of people nowadays have antique brass spittoons in their homes for decorations. If those people had seen the hundreds of spittoons in the building in actual use, they sure wouldn't want them in their home. It's about to gag me just remembering them as I write this. No way could I stand to pick one up, even if it had been sterilized in a hospital. A popular pastime, or bad habit, depending on how you look at it, was whittling. About half of the men on the yards whittled, but I don't remember of anyone during my time whittling anything useful. Anytime a group sat around, whether talking business or shooting the bull, pocket knives appeared and the whittling started. Anything made of wood was fair game for the whittler. It made no difference if it was a supporting post for a booth, the bench they were sitting on, a fence, feed trough, or even woodwork or furniture in the exchange building. It was whittled, and quite a few items were ruined by the whittlers. Not all whittling was intentional. Some whittlers just had the habit and unconsciously opened up a knife and went to work on any available wood. To prevent whittling, which really was destructive to necessary items, a tin edging was nailed around most things that could be damaged, such as water coolers, benches, booth posts, etc. All the fence posts on the yards were fine quality northern cedar, soft, straight-grained, and perfect for whittling. Anytime an old post was removed from a fence, it gathered a group of whittlers and was cut into handy-sized pieces faster than a bunch of buzzards could clean up a rabbit. If several whittlers were sitting around with some good cedar, the shavings could literally cover the ground around them. I might add that all knives were kept as sharp as possible, and you could shave with most of them. After making the rounds of the scales, signing for cattle, and copying weights from scale tickets, chasing down a calf or two that may have turned back on you, and bringing the cattle to your division, you either started on another pickup or began sorting cattle. In very few cases were cattle shipped to the customer, as they had been bought from the commission company. There were always some too large or too small for the load you were working on, and they were sorted out to go in another load. Cattle were driven to the end of an alley, then driven one by one down the side of the alley by the man doing the sorting, and sometimes one or more yard hands, depending on the length of the alley. As they were cut from the bunch, the sorter called out "in" or "by" to the man working the gate into the pen. If "in" was called, the gate was opened and the animal turned in. If "by" was called, the animal was driven on by the gate and held at the other end of the alley until the sort was completed. The cycle was repeated over and over until all the cattle were sorted by color, size, shape, sex, quality, etc., according to the way they were to be shipped. If a lot of sorting was necessary, pens on both sides of the alley might be used. This worked so long as the sorter remembered which pens was for which animals. This job sounds like it takes only a few minutes, but if you were sorting 100 or so animals into 5 or 6 different classes, you had to repeat the operation over and over. If any cattle got by the gate man, then you had to go into the pen and get out the mistakes. Once a load was sorted, you checked them carefully to see if they were all the same size and shape and looked good together. If not, sort again. After sorting, the cattle were fed. Later in the day, when you had the load complete and thought they had gained enough weight to be profitable, you drove them to number 4 scale, where they were weighed to your customer, turned over to the stockyards company, and driven to the shipping division. Depending on the season and the number of orders you had, you might ship 1 load or 15 or more. Weight gain meant profit to the trader, but the amount of gain had to be reasonable or it could hurt the trader's reputation. Cattle will lose a lot of weight on a train trip for several days. And if they had an excessive amount of fill and then showed a lot of shrink on arrival, it could cost the trader a customer. A lot of care was necessary to see that the cattle gained just the right amount of weight and no more. When cattle were quiet, had a lot of clean hay and a trough full of clean water with a faucet that was gurgling and trickling a small stream, they would put on a lot of weight in a couple of hours. There was an art to making the faucet trickle just right, and the drain plug had to be set so that the inflow and outflow of water was balanced. The stockyards company frowned on this practice because it wasted a lot of water, and stockyards hands were ordered to turn off trickling faucets if they saw them. C. Sloan estimated that a calf would gain about a dime per swallow. He liked to watch cattle standing at the water trough and count the dimes. Not all fill was profit because the cattle lost some weight and all the handling they went through after leaving the commission company, and it took some fill just to break even. Around noon, you could go get something to eat. If you didn't have a lot to do, you could drive some distance from the yards to eat, but if you were busy, the best thing was to grab something in the building at Charlie's Coke stand or from one of the vendors who made the rounds of the yards. During my time, there were no real good eating places close to the yards. The Cattleman's Restaurant opened, I believe, in 1947, but the prices were a little steep for the ordinary hands who only ate there occasionally. There were several greasy spoon-type cafes in the area, but too much grease doesn't mix with hard work. If someone discovered a new or better place to eat, it wasn't long before a lot of hands were eating there. Some of the popular eating places at the time were the Up to Date Cafe, Ann's, Skyline Grill, Deer's Barbecue, Macy's, Herman Gruby's, Farmer's, Heine's, and several others that I can't recall. I remember hearing about the Texas City explosion on the car radio in 1947 when we were on our way to eat at Macy's on Jacksboro Highway. Several of us were among the first customers of Herb Macy's when he opened his restaurant on 8th Avenue after leaving his brother's restaurant on Jacksboro Highway. Anytime that C. Sloan went with us to eat, we always let him pay for the food, so he didn't go with us too often. The main reason, though, was that he wanted to sit around and watch the cattle fill. Sloan complained of a bad stomach for years. I think one of the reasons for the stomach problem was the standing order he gave us to bring him when we went to eat. 2 pieces of dry bread with a thick piece of American cheese between them and a cup of coffee. A man known as Shorty made the rounds of the yards during the cooler months selling homemade tamales. He carried them in a couple of 10-gallon lard cans lined with newspapers. I don't know how he kept them as hot as he did, but they warmed many a stomach on cold winter days. I think he sold them for 50 cents a dozen, and we thought he was robbing us. A man named Johnson was on the yards around noon every day for a couple of years. He sold sandwiches that helped you get by. He supposedly had a contract to furnish sandwiches for the county jail, and we accused him of selling us sandwiches that prisoners wouldn't eat. A man from Newark named Slim sold sandwiches, candy, and ice cream. He usually worked from about 10 in the morning until 4 or 5 or later in the afternoon and worked there for several years. He usually worked around the drive-in gate or the north part of the yards. Stockyard company employees could not leave the yards to eat, so they brought their lunches. Quite often, they had to eat on the run because business didn't stop for anything. Since there were pot-bellied coal stoves in the scale houses, the stockyards company hands always had warm food in the winter. Just because you had shipped everything didn't mean the day was over. You still had to feed the remaining cattle, drain the water troughs, and lock the pens. There was a certain way to lock the pens. If they were not locked properly, the keyman was not supposed to unlock them. Water troughs were drained at night for several reasons. One was that cattle would drink more water if they had had none for several hours. Another reason was that water needed to be kept clean for the cattle, and there was a danger of feed or manure getting in the trough at night. Before you locked the pens, you had to be sure that all the cattle that had been bought had been picked up. When Darrell Hampton worked for Clarence Sloan, he was notorious for buying 1 or 2 head at the end of the day from Alonzo Keene, who weighed at number 5. I hated to answer the phone 15 or 20 minutes after Darrell left because I knew the message would be, "I bought a couple from Alonzo and he will weigh 'em in a little while," or "Alonzo weighed me a couple I bid on this morning." This caused us to make a late trip to number 5 or number 1 to pick up 1 or 2 head. After Darrell went into business for himself, Sloan would manage to buy 1 or 2 when he was on his way to the building at the end of the day. Most of the traders liked to sit around and talk after the work was apparently over, and many times I begged to leave for the day so I could get some work done at home. But I was always told that if you have a store, you have to keep it open. This may be true, but I doubt that C. Sloan ever sold over a dozen head a year this late in the day. Every Friday, cattle that would be held over the weekend had to be weighed to make the paperwork balance out. When the cattle were weighed, the scale ticket was marked invoice, and this ticket was proof that the operator had the correct number of cattle. In this case, the cattle were not handled by the stockyards company, but were taken back to the pens by the trader. If a trader needed to know the weight of a bunch of cattle, he could drive them to the scales and obtain a catch weight on them. Again, they were taken back by the trader. Not every cattle deal was made by weight. If cattle were sold by the head instead of weight, they were driven to the scales and counted across to the buyer. In this way, the stockyards company recorded the transaction by the number of head. Some traders, particularly the smaller ones, would sell cattle for 2 bits on the ticket. This meant that they would transfer the weight of the animal when they bought it to the customer and charge 25 cents per 100 pounds for a profit. The price could be negotiated, of course. By doing this, the trader was not concerned about a fill on the animal. I've seen lots of outsiders bid this way on cattle because they were afraid that the trader would try to get to them. Cattle that were being transferred were driven to the scales and counted across, like sales by the head. The weight master made a transfer ticket showing the weight, number of head, and ticket number of the original scale ticket. Another chore was making trips to the building to deliver scale tickets or other information to the girls in the office, or pick up a clearance for cattle being shipped by truck. After I had been on the yards a couple of years, I was bonded so that I could sign clearances without having to make the long round trip to the building. The day had started at 6 in the morning, and it might now be 6 or 7 or later at night. Although there were times when we worked 16 or 18 hours or even more, there were a lot of times during the slack winter months that we did not work over 2 or 3 hours a day on the yards. During those times, we spent a lot of hours working in the country. Nearly all the buyers and commissionmen ran cattle in the country, and during the off-season, we usually worked on fixing pens and fences and other chores on their land. Chapter 4: Wheelers and Dealers. 2 entities on the yards that absolutely could not survive without each other were the dealers and commission companies. Without the dealers, the commission companies would be able to sell only to the packing houses. Without the commission companies, the dealers would have no cattle to buy. The name cattle dealer covers several different types of individuals or companies. There is the order buyer who is bonded to buy cattle only when he has an order for them. The speculator or trader does not have to have an order to buy cattle, but buys them hoping he can resell to an order buyer, packing house, or outsider who may be looking for cattle. The terms speculator, order buyer, cattle buyer, trader cattle dealer, or cattle broker were used rather loosely and could at times apply to nearly anyone on the yards. At some time or another, any cattle buyer had to take some cattle he did not want in order to fill his orders and therefore had some extra cattle to dispose of. He had to try to sell them to another trader or plant them with a commission company and hope to make a profit. To eliminate a lot of confusion, I will use the term buyer to cover all types of traders, dealers, etc. A buyer or company could be one individual or a dozen or more in the business of buying cattle. If an individual buyer was in business for himself, he was the whole crew, from yard hand to boss. An individual might have no more than a couple of pens assigned to him by the stockyards company, while a large firm could have a dozen or more pens and maybe 3 or 4 buyers and 6 or 8 yard hands. Although there was a lot of paperwork required, no individual, whether he was a buyer or a small commission man, had enough work to require a full-time secretary or a large office. Most of them had office space and clerical help in a larger office or clearinghouse. Some buyers owned their own booths, while others shared. Sloan, for instance, shared his booth with a couple of other buyers for many years. In most cases, this was a free rent proposition with the exception of the telephone bill. Practically all of the order buyers seemed to take a turn being the biggest operator on the yards, but none of them held the status longer than a few years, and I can't recall any that ever got to the top again after losing it. At one time, Clarence Sloan was the biggest operator, having 6 or 8 hands working for him, as well as a couple of buyers. He stayed on top during the late 30s and early 40s. After he slowed down in 1946, Sloan bought and sold more than 13,000 head, almost $1 million worth, and his profit was about $2 per head. After Sloan lost out, Allen and Flanagan, who later became Rogers and Lane, held the lead for some time, then lost out to Thompson, Tuttle, and Thompson, who later lost out to J.D. Van, later Van Roach. I am not familiar with too many buyers before C. Sloan, but there were many others. Maybe one reason for the ever-changing lead is that most of these buyers shipped cattle to 1 or 2 geographic areas, and after a few years of shipping breeding stock to an area, the local people were raising their own cattle, and the dealer became a victim of his own success. Some of the buyers of my time, operating under their own or various company names, were Walter Graves, Dutch Volkel, Eddie Volkel, Darrell Hampton, Jeff Albin, Herbert Albin, M.Z. Thompson, Bob Thompson, Ernest Tuttle, Sam Rogers, Boog Allen, Joe Flanagan, J.A. Tadlock, Albert Tadlock, Hardy Tadlock, Pee Wee Nix, Goldie Corbin, Big Windy Ryan, Hecky Stetler, Mel Cooper, Wiley Alliston, Elsie Cheek, Hilton Kutch, Bob Noel, Dallas Van, J.D. Van, Phil Weaver and Sons, Joe Garrett, Dudley Blaine, Jack Bullard, Raymond Bullard, Buddy Burns, Norman Campbell, Paul Campbell, Clarence Chappell, Winfred Christian, Joe Fisk, Ruskin Fisk, Ingy Fort, Roy Harrison, Harold Wright, Jack Huffman, Paul Huffman, DeWitt Kerr, Wade Little, Ivy Little, Bill Matthews, Obie McCampbell, George Reese and Son, Harvey Roach, Bill Roach, Wayne Robinson, Orville Senzibaugh, Jim Stevenson, George Wilderspin, and several more. Many of the buyers were or had been in partnership with others, and a lot of them had been in several different partnerships. Most buyers specialized in certain types of cattle. For instance, Sloan handled mostly Hereford and Angus stockers, steers, and heifers. Occasionally, he would handle orders for Hereford or Angus cows, but hardly ever any plain-type cattle. One company never got any larger or smaller in the many years that it operated there, and that was J.A. Tadlock and Sons. The reason is that the Tadlocks bought only bulls and nothing else. All the yard hands were jealous of the Tadlocks because they always left the yard several hours before anybody else got through. There was a simple reason for this. The bulls were a nuisance. They were always fighting each other and had to be kept in separate pens at the commission companies. The companies needed to get the bulls weighed and out of their way so that they could have more room. To do this, they weighed every bull to Tadlock as soon as possible. The Tadlocks picked up the bulls early to get them out of the scale pens, where they were also causing problems. The Tadlocks sold most of the bulls to the packers by the penful, and as a result, their work was over fairly early in the day. Smaller, individual operators covered the entire yards alone buying cattle. Some of the larger operators with several buyers assigned their buyers to specific commission companies, similar to the way the packers operated. A couple of small traders would sit around the building, and when they saw a stranger come in, they would corner him and try to get his business. One of these men was a notorious liar who would tell any story to turn business his way, even telling some that the man the stranger was looking for had died or gone out of business. Commission companies were in the business of selling cattle for owners who shipped their cattle to Fort Worth. They acted as agents for the owners and showed the cattle in the best way possible to bring the best price. The commission companies sorted cattle so that the best ones would be shown together. One bad animal in a pen can bring the same result as a bad apple in a bushel. Commission companies sent representatives to the country to drum up business for themselves in the Fort Worth stockyards. Commission companies could not operate if there were no buyers, so everybody had to get along with each other. The larger commission companies might have a calf salesman, cow salesman, sheep salesman, and hog salesman, plus a head yardman, head weigher, driver, and 2 or 3 other yardmen, plus an owner or 2 and an office staff of 6 or 8. The smaller ones, just like the dealers, were a one-man operation. Sometimes 5 or 6 of these 1- or 2-man companies would hire an individual to represent all of them as a hog or sheep salesman. Most companies handled all types and breeds of cattle, sheep and hogs. Since I was on the sheep yards maybe once or twice in my 10-year tour of duty, I won't try to give any details of their operation. None of the commission companies were involved in the horse and mule business, but a lot of the horse and mule men had ranches and traded in cattle. The larger commission companies were National Livestock Commission Company, Daggett Keene Commission Company, Texas Livestock Marketing Association, and Cassidy Southwestern Commission Company. Slightly smaller were Keene & Sons, John Clay and Company, George W. Saunders, Woody Kutch, Farmer, Folly Allen, Norrid Hutchins, Jerry Rawls, Pfeiffer, Shirley, and Jerry Commission Company. Smaller still were Bill Barse, George Crowley, Clyde Kutch, Ken Thornton, Carson, Ham, Breedlove, Drive-In, Helm, Howell Brothers, Honeycutt, Lone Star, Pete Wallace, Marvin Wright, and Jimmy Walsh. Even though some of the companies were small in size, any of them could have shippers that might send them several loads of cattle at a time. Commission men, like order buyers, formed partnerships and changed their company names quite often. In all cases, commission companies were referred to by a shortened name: Texas for Texas Livestock Marketing Association, Daggett for Daggett Keene Commission Company, etc. Commission companies were also like order buyers in that they seemed to take turns at being the largest. This, of course, was due to their management, ability to provide services and get the best prices for their customers. Some of the largest were locally owned, while others were a branch operation of a company that usually had offices in Chicago, Omaha, St. Louis, Denver, Kansas City, Oklahoma City, Houston, and San Antonio. The small 1- or 2-man operations were locally owned. Several of the commission companies provided an order buying service. In some cases, a salesman would double as an order buyer, while some of the larger companies hired men who were full-time order buyers. Every operator on the yards had to be bonded, have money to operate, office space, and some pens. In the case of commission companies, some regulations of the Packers and Stockyards Act of 1921 require that certain amounts of money be set aside in certain accounts in order to operate. This was to guarantee that payment could be made immediately to shippers when their cattle were sold. The United States Department of Agriculture didn't like the idea of checks floating or bouncing. Some of the smaller operators simply did not have the capital to finance their operations, so the clearinghouse was the answer. The largest clearinghouse operators during my time were T.B. Saunders and Company and Thornton and Company. Several commission companies, including Folly Allen, cleared a few traders and dealers. A clearinghouse operator would furnish operating money, office space, and clerical help for a percentage of the money used. I think this rate was also regulated by the Packers and Stockyards Act. Some, but not all, of the larger commission companies acted as a clearinghouse for 1, 2, or several operators. T.B. Saunders and Company was one of the larger clearinghouses. Tom furnished money and office space for quite a few traders and commission companies. Sloan lost a ton of money operating a clearinghouse in 1929, and even when he was the largest operator on the yards, he refused to use his own money, but operated through Tom Saunders. In later years, he was offered a private office and a lot of fringe benefits by one of the larger commission companies if he would let them handle his business, but he refused to move. Most clearinghouses consisted of one large office with a roll-top desk for each commission company. There was a small wooden sign painted green with gold letters on each desk. I don't know if the shape and color of the signs was regulated, but I believe everyone in the building was the same type. The operator had his own phone on his desk, and at night he could close and lock the roll top with the phone safely inside. To communicate rapidly enough to take advantage of market prices, telegrams were used a lot until the late 30s. Letters were not fast enough. Although things were pretty modern in the 40s and 50s, not every farm or ranch had a telephone, and communications were sometimes difficult between buyers and sellers. In some cases, it was necessary to leave messages for customers at the local feed store or filling station. In some small towns, it was necessary to go to the local telephone office to make a long-distance call. One reason for this was to give the customer a chance to talk in private, because most of the rural lines were party lines, and most people didn't care to let everybody know their business. In many cases, arrangements were made by mail or telegram to expect a phone call on a certain night and time. I've noticed recent television commercials about the telephone companies switching calls all around the nation electronically in a few seconds. This is a far cry from the many nights I got a geography lesson listening to the long-distance operator call city after city, routing a call to a customer in Virginia or Kentucky. If you placed a person-to-person call in those days, the operator didn't give up until she located your party. I have heard operators call 6 or 8 stores or houses in a rural town trying to locate the party, sometimes taking an hour to locate him. Sometime in the early 50s, a privately owned paging system was installed at the yards. For a monthly fee, subscribers could call Thornton's office, where the unit was kept, and have them page someone on the yards. Several speakers were installed and pretty well covered the yards. The service was used by a lot of people, but Sloan was too tight to subscribe. In most cases, a clearinghouse was a safe investment if the owner was careful in screening the traders he cleared. However, clearing business for a few questionable operators could be pretty risky because it didn't take very many carloads of cattle to run into a lot of dollars. During my time, there were a few operators who cost their clearinghouses a lot of money because of shady deals, and in some cases, the operator was barred from trading on the yards by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In one case, known to most people on the yards, a trader lost a bunch of money on a cattle deal, and the owner of the clearinghouse got his name removed from the trader's bond, but left another trader to stand the loss, which was tremendous. Mentioning names in this case won't help anything because the ones who need to know already do.